At 19 years old, Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook in his Harvard dorm room. But there's a problem. Movies like The Social Network were supposed to inspire the next generation of young tech billionaires. But instead, all we got was Liz Holmes and Sam Bankman-Fried. So if they're not the next Mark Zuckerberg, then who is?
That first dollar you make online is like the best feeling ever.
Meet Armon, co-founder of AfterSell. In his college dorm room, he's built one of the world's most important tech startups, working with brands like MrBeast, True Classic, and many more. He's building a mini Berkshire Hathaway, but instead of buying boring, lame businesses, he and his team buy and build apps that allow online merchants to grow their business. He's become one of the top Shopify app creators in the world, generating millions of dollars in sales. And just like Zuckerberg, he started all this when he was just 19 years old. We talked about how he even came up with the idea for AfterSell while in school.
Through that experience, that was my introduction to the world of business. Like, hey, I think we have something here.
And Armon gave advice on how anyone could do what he did, no matter their age or experience.
100%. I think anyone can do it. There's one main shift you have to make.
Dude, that's insane.
So how did this entrepreneurship journey even start for Armon after all? It actually began with a small YouTube channel. There's always these types of kids that are like the scrappy kind of business types of guys, right? Or girls. I'd love to hear kind of about what was the first domino that really helped you kind of uncover going into business and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I hear lots of those stories as well. Usually for kids, it's like selling candy at school or something like that. For me, my first business was it wasn't even a business when I started. I was maybe 12 years old. It was like a YouTube channel. I didn't even know it was it could turn into a business at the time. Have you seen those awards that YouTube gives out, those play buttons for when you get 100K or 1 million subscribers?
Yeah, for sure.
When I was a kid, I just really wanted one of those. So I started my own YouTube channel and I would just post random things. It would just fail every year, but I would always give it another crack. By the time I was around 15 years old, so after 3 years of trying it, it eventually started to work. And on that YouTube channel, I would upload those. Have you seen those life hack videos where it's 5 life hacks?
Yeah.
Or those you see on Facebook sometimes as well. So I would upload those types of videos and, it started to randomly take off. Eventually, that YouTube channel crossed 100,000 subscribers and I got that place I wanted. But through that experience, that was my introduction to the world of business. Because none of my parents, my siblings, none of them were really that involved in the entrepreneurship world. So I didn't even know it was a potential career path. Through wanting to get that YouTube play button, I learned what entrepreneurship and business really was.
Dude, that's insane. As what happened to it since? What was the next step after that, post YouTube?
That channel kept growing for a bit. I think it peaked at around 30-40 million views on that channel. But eventually I decided to pivot to another business. Obviously there was more learnings I could have had through that YouTube business, but I was ready to kind of move on to something else and try something else. And that's when I was kind of introduced to the world of e-commerce. So my current business now does e-commerce software, but my first introduction to e-commerce was as a store owner, as a merchant myself, selling things online.
What was the feeling when you were no one's telling me what to do? I can actually go and literally create something out of nothing, right? What was that kind of feeling with YouTube and eventually to e-commerce, that kind of notion of autonomy?
Yeah, I would say that that first dollar you make online is the best feeling ever. It's kind of downhill from there. No, I'm kidding. When that happens, you kind of feel all the potential that there is. And it just feels amazing because you know that if you just keep working at it, eventually it could turn into something bigger.
You have a twin brother I found online.
Yeah. Good research.
Thank you. It sounds like you're more of the risk-taking type of guy. Your brother, who is going into medicine, I believe, that's a bit different of a career path. I'm curious, definitely in terms of twins, nature versus nurture. You guys were literally, in the world at the same time. What do you think kind of was the initial point for you to even realize that you are the risk-taking type? I guess what was that kind of experience like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So growing up, I would actually say that both me and my brother were actually both of us were passionate and interested about medicine. Even when I was going into university, I was still unsure of what path I wanted to go down. So the university I went to had an interesting program. So I studied business in university. The program was quite unique in the way that for the first 2 years of a 4-year degree, it allowed you to study whatever program you wanted. And then the actual business school would start in the 3rd year. That kind of gave me the opportunity to explore both the sciences and business. My first 2 years, I kind of went more down that science path. I took bio, chem, physics, all those classes. To be honest, initially, I wasn't much of a risk taker myself. I kind of set myself a goal where hey, if I can get this business stuff to work and start generating like a baseline, like safe level of income in those 2 years, then I'll kind of go all in on that entrepreneurship route. It wasn't like too much of a risk there personally, since I still had that option of going down that medicine route. I was still like interested in that route as well, and it was like a possible career path.
It's interesting because it's like calculated risk. It's not like you're putting all your eggs in, right? You had this like really great backup that could have materialized, right? If the one that's more risky didn't really pan out, but obviously it did. You go into university. I guess what was the moment that you doubled down on business in Beam? What was the inception of that idea?
The inception of Beam was through my e-commerce stores. The product I was selling was like really random. It was like a lunchbox. I know it's like the most random thing ever.
It's okay.
So I started selling just like different products online, and that lunchbox just started selling really well. And I kind of ran that for around 2 years. So this was during my first year of university and second year.
By yourself, just you?
Yeah, this was just me on my own. I think like at the peak, we grew to like a small team of 3. It was like me and then 2 people helping with like customer support. But yeah, that started doing well. And that was kind of my first introduction to the whole world of e-commerce. I didn't really know it was a thing before. Like I knew you could buy things online, but my only experience there was like on Amazon. I didn't really know there were like independent online retailers, that sold through like a platform called Shopify. It was really through my own pain points I experienced through that business where the idea for Beam Commerce was born. Like e-commerce is like a business of like generally slim margins. It's usually under like 20%, maybe like 10 to 20 around that range. Anything you can really do to give you that bit of an edge, that bit of an extra, like a few extra dollars per customer that comes to the door, it's really helpful. There was an app I was using that kind of like built on top of Shopify that helped with like post-purchase upselling. I saw how well that worked. But like through using that, I was like, hey, I could probably build something better here. That's where the first app, which we have called AfterSell, kind of started.
I guess for AfterSell, was it, so that sounds like you incubated it, you built it yourself, or did you go out and buy this existing app? How did that one, I guess, really like start out? And I guess if anything, like initial capital and funding to help start it?
Yeah, for AfterSell, we didn't buy that one. We built that one. We were like super scrappy with the initial build there. I think it was like around $7,000 to build like the initial version. And that took around like 2 months to launch an MVP just onto the market. What we did like initially for the very, very first version, there's this platform called Upwork where you can kind of hire like freelancers from. So we found like a freelance developer through there. And that's kind of how the first version was built for like pretty cheap.
For people that are looking to, use remote labor, how do you go about vetting and finding like a great developer to know that they're actually going to be someone that you can work with? Because if you spend all this time with them and it doesn't pan out, like that can be a huge pain in the butt, right? Because you wasted time, wasted money, you have to delay everything. I'm curious, how did you go about that criteria to figure out if this was the right kind of person to bring on board?
At that point where like AfterSell was initially built, my like technical co-founder hadn't joined yet. To be honest, it was just like pure luck at that point. I came more from the business background, not the tech background. So I had really like no knowledge there. So like I couldn't do like a coding interview with like the individual we hired there. The only resources I had there were kind of his resume and his past work experience. So to decrease like the risk there as much as possible, I just went with someone who'd built like a very similar product before in the Shopify ecosystem. So that way I was sure that they were like familiar with the APIs, with e-commerce as a whole. They had like a baseline level of, like software development understanding that like should have been sufficient for what we needed.
How old were you when this was happening?
This was during my second year of university, I believe. So around like 19 or 20.
Did your parents know what you were doing? Well, I guess, what was that conversation like? Or did you even have a conversation with them? Were you just like, I'm going to do it?
At that point, I'd made a decent amount of money from those like e-commerce businesses. My parents kind of like trusted me at that point with what I was doing. They're like, okay, he's not just playing like games on his computer. Like he's like actually working, like he's doing something useful with his time. They kind of trusted me at that point. So like I didn't really like consult them there on that.
The point you made around, you also kind of like me are the more business, non-technical type of guy, right? You noted you brought in technical support with other co-founders, Drew and Varun and Landon. I'd love to hear about how you found them and bringing them into the team.
Yeah, that's a great question. I knew Drew through like a scholarship program we were both in. So there was this like scholarship where you could kind of go to like any university you wanted in Canada and they would like cover most of the tuition. The story's kind of funny. Like as part of that scholarship, there's like a camping trip component to it at the start. So me and Drew were actually in like the same like camping group. So like we were like lifting canoes together and like like walking through the wilderness. Neither of us are like the outdoors type of person, so it was just like a really like cool experience. and I got to know him really well through there. But then we both kind of like went off to different universities, and like we still kept in touch, but like we were both working on like different businesses at the time. I had the e-commerce store. He had his own like other company that he was working on. I think like it was a social media platform. Once those different businesses that we were working on came to a close, we kind of came together and thought like, hey, it could be a good idea to work here together. And then with Landon and Varun, at a similar time, they were working on a different app that was called UpCart. So
I see now.
yeah, we kind of decided like, hey, why not come together and work together on this? And like Landon and Varun were like childhood friends of Drew's. Like Drew went to high school and like middle school with Landon, and like Varun went to a different school, but he knew him as well. So
I'm seeing the dots connect now. That's very cool. So you build AfterSell. That was really the first app, and then you bring in UpCart, I believe you called it. I'd love to hear about like the next step. Like what happened to really like grow these businesses, and then eventually turning this into like Beam and thinking about other different types of transactions and things you wanted to work on. I believe 4 transactions you guys have done. I think 3 were buying, 1 was selling. And we'll get more into like the famous tweet and like that process. But I love to hear about uniting everything, turning that into like Beam itself.
When AfterSell started working, and then UpCart, we're like, hey, I think we have something here with like Shopify apps. Like at that point, we had there was like us 4, me, Drew, Landon, and Bruno as like co-founders. We thought, hey, why not expand this and build more apps in different categories? So that's kind of when we transitioned from just those 2 apps to building out more apps. And it was actually the opposite. We sold 3 apps and bought 1. But yeah, so we just kept building apps out in different categories within that e-commerce space, things like order tracking, like pre-purchase offers, different tools like that. And we just started building out more and more apps. And I think at the peak, we had maybe like 7 different apps that we were running at once.
Oh my God.
But that was like,
oh my God, that's so that sounds like a headache.
To be honest, you're right. Like it was a headache. It was too much. So what we decided is like, this isn't good, right? Like our focus as a team is split across so many different apps. We have like 1 app per team member. Like this isn't good. So we kind of decided to scale back and really like focus on our winning apps, which were AfterSell and UpCart. So we decided to either like shut down or sell off the remaining apps we had and really focus on what was working for us. And like after we made that decision, our growth really picked up. Customers were happier, and I think it was like the best decision we could have made.
When you say working, the apps were like working. What does that mean? Is it like 1,000 a month in MRR? I guess. What is that? What? How do you define that in your eyes?
Yeah, so I think at that point, like a low 10,000s
a month.
Yeah, a month in MRR on those apps, and that's kind of when we decided to kind of like, oh, let's ramp this up.
Dude, I mean, what you said makes a lot of sense. Like even when I was in school, if I'm like in a million clubs trying to do job recruiting and like class on top of that, like I'd rather do a few things very well than like divide my like time, energy, my mental load on like a million things and do them kind of mid, right, and subpar. So I think that's a very good lesson here from what you're saying, dude. It's really good that you realize this early on too. It's not a, when you're so excited and you're creative and you want to do a lot of different things, like that's hard, especially like shutting things down too. Like that's not easy, especially after the time and like and the effort put into it.
Exactly.
So after this point, you have the 2 properties, right? UpCart, AfterSell. When you think about optimization, what are the like levers that you think about? And this could be relevant for non-Shopify apps, maybe just software generally. What are some of the things that you thought about and to improve it, and identifying like pain points for potential like other growth ops for these apps as well?
I would say there's like a few core categories in the business. One of them is like definitely product, ensuring that, we have the features that customers are looking for. The user interface, the user experience, all of that is perfected. So customers know how to use the app. They can find the features they're looking for. Integrating different functionality that kind of leads to like a more like viral growth where, customers, when they set it up on their store, other potential customers see that and come and install our apps. So I would say lots of our growth, at least initially, was product driven. The second for us is more on that like marketing sales side of things. At least initially, like our product lives on an app store, the Shopify app store. So they help out a lot, at least initially, with getting our first few customers. But eventually you kind of want to expand out of that and attract customers yourself. One, it just allows for more scale, and 2, it's safer than depending on an app store, because there's always changes to the App Store algorithm, which can kind of derail your business if that's the only growth channel which you have. So we kind of started introducing more growth channels, like, like working with influencers, running ads, producing content, running like a cold outreach process. I would say that was kind of the next main lever for growth that we experienced.
Which one did you find worked the best in terms of going viral? Because that's everyone's ideal thing, right? What was the thing that really was the unlocker for that? Was it influencers? Was it paid search? Was it just organic social? I guess, what did you kind of find was the magic ingredient there?
So for SaaS, it's like, at least in my experience, I found there's not like one channel. When I came from like the e-commerce world as a merchant myself, all you really needed was like store and Facebook ads. And with that, you could scale past like 100K a month with just that one channel.
Wow.
With software, it was much more difficult, in my opinion. All the different growth channels, product, tech, all those come together to kind of add like a few percentage points in growth. And then once you have all those like 1-2% growth levers, they all kind of combine and create a business that is able to grow fast.
And each business is different.
Yeah,
different styles of growth, as you noted. So you had a pretty famous tweet. It kind of went viral, man. It got 100,000 views on Twitter, which is nuts, right? That's a lot of eyes. What was the business that actually turned into that 6-figure transaction? I'd love to hear about that journey, and the feelings you were going through there.
This was during the phase we were in where we were like heavily expanding, building out more apps. And one path we considered was building an app can sometimes take a while, like 2, 3, maybe up to like 6 months sometimes, just to even get an MVP out there in the market. So we thought, hey, why not consider acquisition as a potential path to expanding our business? There's this platform that we use called MicroAcquire. I think they recently rebranded, but it's like a great platform where you can find different businesses for sale. Most of them are SaaS businesses usually. So we subscribed to that, and I think we were on the platform there for at least like a year, just looking through deals. Initially, I don't even know if we were on it to necessarily like make a purchase. It's also good just to see like the state of the market and like what's selling. But when we kind of transitioned to wanting to buy, we just kind of kept an eye out for different deals that were on the market, and we eventually came across one that was super in line with what we liked. So like the product was good. It seemed to have solved like a pretty decent pain that customers are experiencing. The design was great. The one part which they weren't great at was the distribution side. That was like the marketing plus app store optimization. So just optimizing for ranking as high as possible on that Shopify app store. And at the time we were really good at like app store optimization. That was like one of our main strengths. So we thought, hey, like this is a perfect fit.
This was over how long did you find that first deal, the 70K deal? And when was this? Give some, I guess, idea on time. Was it 2021, 2022?
I think this was start of 2022, I believe, or like end of 2021. Yeah. And the deal closed around like February 2022, and we found like the listing for sale maybe in like December of 2021. So it's maybe like a 3-month process.
Can you walk me through that experience? Like, what is actually happening? I don't know if it's a negotiation per se, or is it just a straight buyout price? Just what was that kind of dialogue like? I imagine if I'm the seller and I see these like 4 kids, maybe I don't know if they're thinking you're kids or you wearing like a fake mustache. I'm curious, like, what was that kind of like discussions like between maybe you guys internally, but also the seller as well?
Yeah, so I feel like the seller here was like in a bit of a unique position. They were kind of like pivoting their business. They'd raised a bunch of money and they were kind of going down a different path. I think they were doing like the agency model initially, just like servicing e-commerce merchants. They had this kind of like SaaS product on the side, and then they fully pivoted into SaaS, but like a completely different platform they were building. So they were just kind of like selling this asset off to kind of really focus on that. So I think they were in a unique position there. But yeah, I guess like internally, like it was our first experience ever buying something. So we were super green. We were like super new to it. So we definitely made a lot of mistakes during that process. Maybe with like negotiation, we probably overpaid there and like went in too excited. We kind of like showed off all our cards initially. Probably not the best approach. But yeah, like that's part of entrepreneurship. Especially if you're young and new to it, you just make a ton of mistakes, and like it's kind of expected almost.
For sure. I guess when you say you showed your cards too much, I hear that all the time.
Yeah.
What were the things that you did, and guess what would you have done differently going in another transaction?
Yeah, I feel like you just like you can't go in there and like only say the great things about like what they built. Like I don't mean like bash what they built, Like it was an awesome product. We're happy with it. But we went in that meeting and like we were too excited. And like he could tell,
Oh,
right?
he saw you and he was like, these kids are.
Yeah. Like yeah, so we kind of ended up getting like bid up a lot on the initial price we wanted. And I think part of that was just because it was like actually a good product and there was other interested parties. But part of that was probably our like inexperience. You know, like I feel like you can kind of read when a person's like in that scenario, and in like a negotiation, it's like all about leverage and you kind of lose all your leverage there.
So we talked a bit about optimization, right? I'd love to hear the kind of acquisition criteria process. What are the questions that you're thinking about that would make this kind of a worthwhile thing to go after?
I guess like initially the first main aspect we were looking at was that it was a good fit for our team. So at the time we were like constrained on dev resources. We wanted something that, you know, had like good tech and wouldn't need a ton of rework, you know, like marketing and the app store optimization side of stuff could really take the main focus. At the time we had like 7 apps, right? So our tech team was a bit like hampered there with our time. So we really wanted something that where like marketing was the focus, but it can always be the opposite as well for other people, right? They may not have that marketing experience. They might want something that's already working where they can kind of focus on tech and product. After we realized there was like good alignment there and that we actually wanted to buy this, the next focus was just like going through the due diligence process, understanding all the details that we could about the business. How do they get their customers? What's their tech stack? We did like proper technical due diligence, looked through their code base, made sure there was nothing sketchy going on there. So yeah, we went through that entire process and a few questions here and there where it didn't really make sense. We got the seller to clarify and then it made sense. Once all those like boxes were checked off, I think it made sense to proceed with the transaction.
In the tweet, it said you 5x'd MRR. Like what was the next step? Do you still own that or did you ended up selling it, I believe?
We went from I think like 7 apps to 3. It was like AfterSell, UpCart, and then this app which is called like Perfect Product Finder. It was like a app for building shopping quizzes.
I remember that. Yeah.
Through that process of kind of like scaling back our apps, we saw like significantly more growth on the other apps, right? So we're like, hey, focus is good. It's a good thing. We should continue like improving our focus and really dial down on the 2 apps that were working the best, which was AfterSell and UpCart. Like that other app wasn't doing bad, but it wasn't doing as good as the other apps. It was still like a tough decision. There's like some emotional attachment you have to like that part of the
For
business.
sure.
And like you're like, no, like it's gonna work, like it's gonna get like it can keep growing, and that's true, it can keep growing. I'm sure like the individual who like acquired it from us has been like growing it well and has seen positive returns hopefully. But there's just something to be said also about the opportunity cost. That time you're putting into this other app is time you're taking away from putting into that other app. Like as tough as it was still like the logical decision to make that sale.
I love to talk about like low points. You noted kind of the emotions of like selling something that you are really like attached to, right? Which is like totally reasonable. You spend a lot of time on it. You think there's a great future for it, but not everything is rosy. I'm curious, what was for you personally like a low point in this journey, and just kind of walking me through the feelings you had there.
That's a great question. Yeah, so I would say the lowest point probably was maybe around like the end of maybe like start of 2022. That's kind of when we had like all these different apps, and we actually like, even though we were like bootstrapped, we weren't cash flow like positive. So we were like burning like a decent amount of cash each month, maybe like $10,000 a month, just to like keep all these apps running. And that was just like a very, very like stressful time period. I would say that was like probably the biggest low point in the business. I think we had to take out some debt as well to like finance part of the acquisition and like just like finance like our cash flow at the time. And yeah, like in hindsight, it was like a worse situation than we realized. And I'm like grateful to say we made it like out of that situation, like with the business still alive. But that was probably like the biggest low point and most stressful time.
Is it you like up very late with the guys trying to figure it out? Is it you like I guess, is it you just like looking at your screen, just like trying to find anything you could think of like at the spot to improve it, like the app? I guess what was kind of the way that you were showing that like the stress and whatnot you were noting?
Yeah, I would say it was kind of like first situation you described, just like either like in person with my co-founders, like late at night, just like working away, trying to figure things out.
Each of you guys are very different
Mm.
Landon, Varun, you, Drew. What have you learned from them in this whole experience? Because you guys can be kind of like sounding boards for each other. What was the team's emotion during this experience?
I would say just like having a good team and people you can really connect with is like extremely valuable when running a company. My previous companies were all like solo. One, it's not as fun, but two, it's like 10 times as much stress. During those like low points, it's always good to have like someone by your side that you know is like kind of like fighting with you like alongside you to kind of like achieve the same goal and mission. One point to add on co-founders that I think is like very important is to make sure that you have complementary skill sets. If there's too much overlap on what each person brings to the table, it's not as useful and it can like lead to conflict. So it's good if everyone has like just like unique skill sets that they bring and can focus on different aspects of the business.
Between the three of them, what do you think you've learned uniquely from each of them?
Yeah, so I would say like for me as a whole, like just coming into this business, I had like zero understanding of how like tech businesses ran. So I would say that's the biggest thing I learned. You know, I learned about software, I learned about product, I learned about tech. These were all things like I didn't know. Like to give some context, like initially when we were building the first version of the app, like I didn't know what like the developer, I didn't even have access to like the GitHub where like the code was stored because I didn't know what that was. Like that's how limited my software and like tech knowledge was. So I really learned about like that side of the world, and like thankfully now I would say like I have a better understanding of that. I'm like super grateful for.
Of the three, which one helped you kind of learn more about the tech side? Which one helped you learn maybe more about product and then maybe marketing? I'm curious, what are the, between the four of you guys, what kind of skill does each one of you have that you bring to the table that make this like super team?
Yeah, so I would say like personally I focus more on like the marketing side of things. My co-founder Drew, he focuses on like the sales side of things and also kind of like the leadership aspect of like managing a team, hiring, things like that. Varun focuses on kind of like the product and finance side of the business. My other co-founder Landon focuses on like the tech side. So like managing all the developers and writing code. So I would say, yeah, I learned probably those aspects each from all my co-founders, and then all three of them just had like a significantly better understanding than me in like the tech side of things as well. So I learned that from all.
What do you think in terms of like relationships? You talked about relationships with your team,
Hmm.
some employees that you have, merchants, probably other kind of stakeholders that got thrown into the mix, you know, people that you're selling with or buying businesses with. What is this like whole experience with Beam taught you about relationships and connections with people?
I think relationships is probably the most important aspect of any business. You know, like we've been able to build relationships with some of our customers where, you know, they'll kind of like stand out for us and like go recommend us to other merchants and things like that and help us drive client acquisition. And that wouldn't be possible if we didn't build out these relationships with these customers. You know, we've built a really good relationship with our entire team where we all feel like a sense of ownership. You know, we'll go the extra mile to, you know, like achieve whatever we're working on, even when like times get tough and like things aren't going the greatest. And I think this is just all driven by like how you approach building these relationships and how you like treat the people you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. Approach that in like a positive way. It'll just come back to benefit everyone at the end.
Do you think really anyone can do all that you've done, you know, and you're 23, 22, 23?
22, yeah.
Okay. So you're a little bit younger than me and you've done way more cooler stuff than most, you know, early 20-year-olds, right? Do you think most people, do you think anyone can do what you guys are able to pull off? And I guess any advice that you may have for like, you know, budding entrepreneurs, you know, SaaS founders and whatnot?
100%, yeah. I think anyone can do it. I would say there's one main like mindset shift you have to make. And like it might sound kind of like corny or like cliche, but it's like embracing failure. So like when you go through like the schooling system, you're taught that failing is bad, right? You get a bad grade on the test, you fail, you're like reprimanded for that. It's like,
Yeah, dude.
no, you
Yeah.
can't fail, right? And what that leads you to doing is thinking that like, you know, if I fail, it's a bad thing. It's the end of the world. The difference though in entrepreneurship is that like you're gonna fail. It's a given, right? Like day to day, like every single day, there's something I fail at. and that's like the expected. So you have to change your mindset to really like embrace that failure, understand that it's inevitable, and learn from it, and like, take those learnings and use them in the future.
Man, it's like you relate to this as well. And I may have noted it earlier, like having like medical parents, that is like, they don't understand it. Like, I guess because failure for them is like, one, they like immigrated here.
Mm.
So that's a bit, failure was not an option, which I
Exactly.
understand from a like their perspective, but also in a medical context, like you can't, if you're doing like oral dentistry stuff that your mom was talking about, like you cannot mess up someone's teeth. Like that's like that has consequences, right? Or if you're like a heart cardiac surgeon, like okay, like there's really
Yes.
and it's pretty uncomfortable, honestly. Like if you're not used to it, falling on your face, dude. Because when you get over that, then you're like, fuck, like I actually like pulled it off, and you're like, you remember like, wow, this is like where I was before, you know.
Exactly.
It's a really cool thing, and I think like everyone should like at least try something, because dude, you don't want to be like 80 years old and you're like have like regrets, right, about like the thing I should have taken a shot at. Kind of building off of this, if you had no money today, how would you do it differently? Would you do the same thing? Would you go after, would you double down on YouTube again? I guess what would you do differently, knowing what you know now?
Yeah. So if I had no money, I'd probably start in uh, some some business model where like the customer acquisition aspect is like free. So something related to like social media, probably YouTube or TikTok, where like probably TikTok to be honest, or like getting eyeballs on what you're selling or your business or like the service you're providing is basically free. So I would say like starting somewhere there where you can kind of just like input your time and then, get like money as the output there is probably the way to go. Once some of those businesses start working and you start making some money and having some savings there, then you can kind of leverage that to like build out a team or go into like different business models, or maybe like the upfront capital is a few $1,000s and is like software where maybe isn't the best like first business to get into, but probably like a thing down the line that.
How much do you attribute all that you've accomplished at 22 to luck, hard work, or fate?
Hmm. I would say it's kind of hard to like attribute it to fate. Like it could be an aspect, but like, I wouldn't know how to like quantify that to be honest. In terms of like luck and hard work, though, I it's hard to quantify again. I would say both are definitely factors. You need to work hard, that's a given, but you also need to be lucky. You need to be in the right place at the right time. I don't think like AfterSell, for example, be as easy to get to the point where it is now if we had started it a few years later. There's also an aspect here where like the harder you work, the luckier you get as well, just because like you see more of these lucky opportunities that you can take. So it's definitely a mix of both, I would say.
MrBeast, biggest YouTuber in the world, he said in a really interesting interview that while he's like 24 and runs one of the biggest media brands and also consumer brands with Feastables, Beast Burger, and whatnot, it's really cool. But honestly, man, if he was a bit older, he noted that he would have actually been able to start a bunch of different things, different businesses, and really learn from these mistakes.
I'm 24. I wish I was a little bit older so I could have ran a couple companies and failed a few companies in the past and like learn from those and apply those here. Because I know for a fact.
I'm thinking about the notion you talked about going into the negotiation, like all giddy and happy. I guess like what advice do you have for really like young people on taking risks and really wanting to go out and build something for themselves, despite not having, the hindsight of years of experience?
Yeah, I would say one thing to really optimize for early on in like your entrepreneurial journey is to like optimize for learning. So like most people when they start, they optimize for like financial reasons for making money, which I think in the long run kind of ends up shooting yourself in the foot. So like sometimes when you're working on a business or like an idea, it might lead to, like some money in the short term, but if you pivot into something else, you'll learn a lot more, gain a lot more skills that will then help you be even more successful in the future. And it's sometimes hard to like realize that in the moment. You kind of got to take a step back and like look at the bigger picture and see like, is what I'm working on really right now? Am I learning anything? Am I getting more skilled as an entrepreneur? And if the answer is no, especially early on in your career, I would say it's worth potentially pivoting into another business model or something like that, where the learning and upside is higher.
What do you think is next for you? You've done some pretty cool stuff despite just finishing school, I believe, and being in your early 20s. What do you think is the next act for Armon and for Beam itself?
Yeah, so I think for now, the goal is just to keep working on Beam and seeing where we can take that and, like keep focusing on growth there. And then maybe in the future, like expanding our product line in a more sustainable way, learning from our mistakes in the past. And yeah, like for the time being, the plan is just to continue working on Beam. Beyond that, I'm unsure. But in a post Beam life, I know I'll probably be doing something entrepreneurial again as well.
Now the last question is, so there's a lot of like young Persians, young Iranians out there. I guess any advice to them on both back in Iran, just like the issues going on overseas, just on taking big bets and kind of navigating through a challenging time?
I would say, like you see online that like people always say like, oh, take those big bets, take the risk. And, I think taking risks is a good thing. I would just add that make sure it's like a calculated risk. On social media, you'll hear people say like school is bad, drop out, go on in your business. I don't necessarily agree with that because I don't think that's a calculated risk. And I don't think that'll work for everyone. Like, sure, it'll work for a few people, but in the grand scheme of things, I feel like that advice is bad. So I'd say if you're looking to take risk, yeah, really just make sure it's calculated, and that is different based on everyone's like individual, like personal situations. But don't let what you see on like social media and online kind of like cloud your judgment and lead you to making like a rash decision that's probably not best for you. Because the people usually like pushing that information online have like different intentions that aren't necessarily aligned with you. Like what's best for you.
This was awesome. Thanks so much. I learned so much, dude. And I've been wanting to pick your brain about what you guys are working on. I think it's super cool, all that you've kind of pulled off at such a young age. And the best part is just getting started, right?